Okay, we're beginning chapter 15, cardiovascular system, and want to talk initially here about the amazing properties of the heart, your heart. I think this statistic is pretty astounding that each day, each of our hearts pumps close to 2,000 gallons of blood through our body, which in a year would fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's an enormous amount of blood that this fist-sized muscle called the heart, pumps. 2.5 billion pumps in an average lifetime. When we talk about the cardiovascular system, we'll be talking about the heart quite a bit, and in latter parts of the chapter, we'll get into the various types of blood vessels. So both the heart and blood vessels make up our cardiovascular. And we're going to talk about two circuits of blood flow, the first of which is listed here. The pulmonary circuit. Pulmonary refers to what? Lungs, right? So this is simply blood flow from the heart to the lungs. So the blood will be oxygenated, right, at the lungs, and then it will be returned back to the heart. And that's simply the pulmonary circuit. Blood flow from the heart to the lungs and back to the heart. Carried through what's called the systemic circuit. In other words, system-wide. The only place the blood is not traveling while in the systemic circuit is to the lungs. That, as we said a moment ago, referred to pulmonary circulation. Systemic circulation would be the flow of the blood once it comes back from the lungs. It's then, of course, pumped to the rest of the body, to our metabolizing tissues, our muscles, our organs. And there, of course, that oxygen is given up, CO2 is brought aboard the blood, and that blood is taken back to the heart, where it then will enter the pulmonary circuit. Circuits sort of alternate with one another with regard to blood flow. So here we have the pulmonary circuit, shown here on the right-hand side, where the blood is transported now from the heart, and I'll outline this in red. See if we can do this with the pen, or maybe we'll use yellow. So here's the blood coming from the heart, deoxygenated blood, oxygen-poor blood, gets taken to the lungs, where we know a lot of that CO2 is diffused across the respiratory membrane and eventually exhaled. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And then, of course, what is brought aboard the blood? That, of course, is oxygen. Oxygen diffuses across the respiratory membrane, gets into the blood, and then is taken back to the heart. So that refers to the pulmonary circuit. The systemic circuit, of course, shown on the left side here of the diagram, would be blood after it's brought back from the lungs. Let's put that in yellow. It's going to be taken to the rest of the body. I guess that's not a good color to use. So let's do purple. It's coming out of the left side of the heart, and then it gets taken to all of our tissues, all throughout the body, shown here in orange. And there, of course, a lot of that oxygen is diffused across the capillary bed into the tissues. Think of muscle, perhaps. And the CO2 that's generated by cells is, of course, diffusing into the bloodstream, isn't it? And then it's brought back to the heart, where it's then pumped into the pulmonary circuit. So the pulmonary and systemic circuits, again, alternate with one another to achieve adequate blood flow to the tissues. As we look at the relative positioning of the heart in our thoracic cavity, we can sort of see it here as it lies posterior to the sternum. And note that the apex of the heart, which is here at the base, the apex of the heart is tilted slightly to the left. So it's not perfectly centered. It's tilted a bit to the left of center. And of course we see the diaphragm, this important respiratory muscle. So the heart lies just superior to the diaphragm, again a little bit left of center. in our thorax. The relative size of the heart is, again, about the size of your fist. And here we see a cadaver heart on the right-hand side. We see some of the various coronary blood vessels here that's feeding blood to the heart itself or taking blood away from the heart. We'll be talking more about the heart anatomy in just a few moments. But here's that apex that we were talking about a few moments ago, oriented a bit left of center, right, relative to the sternum. So it's not terribly large, really, but such an important muscle, pumping, again, tens of thousands of gallons of blood each and every week throughout our body. Here we're looking at a cadaver where we've removed the thoracic body plate, if you will, and we can see here on our left, the cadaver's right. This is the right lung. And then, of course, here's the left lung. This would be the neck up here. What would this be down here in yellow, or green rather? This is the diaphragm, right? Yeah. So the heart is sort of sandwiched, isn't it, between the lungs. Again, a little bit left of center. There's that apex we talked a little bit about a moment ago. And we can see some of these large blood vessels here that we'll talk more about in a few minutes. Here's a diagram of the heart where we've cut through part of the sac. And we're looking into the heart. We've removed what's referred to as the pericardial fibrous sac of the heart. And again, note the blood vessels here in blue, which are transporting oxygen-poor blood from the heart muscle itself. And then we have the red-colored blood vessels, which are delivering oxygen-rich blood to the heart. So yes, the heart receives among the most oxygenated blood of the body, and it should, because it's doing all this pumping. It certainly deserves a good, rich blood supply, doesn't it? And then the heart muscle, of course, is going to generate carbon dioxide, and that has to be returned back into the circulation through these blue coronary cardiac veins. This is showing in this sort of insert. If we take a little chunk here out of the sac, we can see what's referred to as the fibrous pericardium here in white. Okay, this is fibrous pericardium. This is a very, very tough sac. And just inside the fibrous pericardium is what's called the parietal pericardium, which folds back upon itself to form the visceral pericardium. Remember we said visceral membranes are actually on the surface of the organ, be it the lungs in the case of the visceral pleura, but this is pericardium, so this is referring, of course, to heart. And as you can tell, this is the muscle of the heart called the myocardium. And on the surface of that heart muscle is our visceral, which again, if you look closely, it folds back to form this outer parietal pericardium. And the parietal membranes, we said, lined the cavity within which the organ resides. And so here we see in between those two membranes, the outer parietal and the inner visceral, is our pericardial cavity. And that's filled with serous pericardial fluid that we'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes. Any idea what that might be for? Yeah, we'll talk about that. Okay, another view of the heart. We've removed the outer fibrous sac, and at least in this view, we don't see it very well. Actually, this shows the myocardium. This is the muscular cardiac muscle part of one of the ventricles. And as we look on the inner surface of the myocardium, shown here sort of in white, is the endocardium. It's called endocardium. And as we'll talk more about in a few moments, this endocardium, this innermost layer of the heart itself, has special fibers here called Purkinje fibers. We'll talk about the role that these Purkinje fibers play in what's called the cardiac conduction pathway a little bit later in one of the subsequent voiceover PowerPoints. But just kind of maybe try to remember this term Purkinje. You'll be hearing more about it later, but they are found here embedded within the innermost layer, the endocardium. So we've got inner endocardium, very thin. We have a relatively thick myocardium. Kind of depends upon whether it's the right or left ventricle. The left ventricle myocardium is thicker than the right myocardial layer, but you can tell it's quite thick relative to the endocardium. And then let's talk about some other. As we go on the very, very, very outer surface of the myocardium, there's our visceral pericardium that we've talked about a few moments before in one of the earlier slides. This is sometimes also called the epicardium. So this is on the surface of the myocardium, remember. This is one of those membranes, very, very thin, and it's on the surface of the heart. Again, visceral meaning on the surface of the organ. And you'll notice that just inside the visceral pericardium, we can find blood vessels, and we looked at those a few moments ago in one of the earlier slides as well. So we've got coronary arteries here in red supplying oxygen-rich blood to the myocardium, and then of course we have in blue various cardiac veins that are draining oxygen-poor blood from the myocardium and eventually dumping that into the pulmonary circuit. Also embedded in or just under the visceral pericardium, we note here in yellow, what's this stuff? Anytime you see yellow, that's good old fat, adipose tissue. Yeah, so the heart actually does have a bit of fat, and you can see it much better, of course, in this upper photograph or sketch, I should say. There's quite a bit of fat, more than you might realize, and this is not indicative of somebody who's overweight or anything like that. Healthy athletes do have some degree of fat here just under the epicardium. Here we've got the pericardial cavity, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Remember, this was found between the inner visceral pericardium or epicardium and the outer parietal pericardium. So let me try to draw the parietal pericardium here in blue. It's likewise quite thin. There it is. And between the outer parietal and inner visceral, what did we say was there? The cavity, right? The pericardial cavity. And as I said a few moments ago, there is fluid in here called serous fluid. This is a lubricating fluid produced by these pericardial membranes, and that's to reduce any friction that might form as the heart is pumping and beating inside the fibrous sac, okay, which is on the very outermost surface here of the heart. So this is external to the parietal pericardium, is this fibrous sac. It's a very, very tough sac. You can kind of see through it, but it's somewhat opaque, but it's super strong. And so the heart, of course, is contracting and relaxing, isn't it? And it's doing so inside this fibrous sac. And so the serous fluid produced here is designed to reduce and actually sort of eliminate friction between the fibrous pericardium and the heart itself. Now, as I mentioned just a second ago, and I did use the word opaque, I believe, here you can sort of see through that fibrous pericardium and see the underlying blood vessels, right? Yeah, which we see in cross-section, of course, right there. So let's talk about the anatomy of the heart, and I really wish that we were meeting face-to-face, because then we would do either a deer heart dissection or a pig heart dissection. You'd be able to see these structures up close and personal. But let's talk a little bit about some of the chambers. There are 4, obviously. 2 upper or superior atria. Now, if I'm talking about one, I would use the term atrium. A-T-R-I-U-M, that's one, atrium, so you have a right and a left atrium. If I'm talking plural, I would use the term atria. That means more than one. So you have the two upper atria, the right and left atria, and then below those you have the two lower ventricles, the right and left ventricles. So a total of 4. Let's talk about the right atrium first and understand that this particular smaller chamber is going to receive oxygen poor blood. And we typically will color blood vessels blue if they're carrying oxygen poor blood, as opposed to other blood vessels that we might color red that indicate that they're carrying oxygen rich blood. Okay, so get into the habit of looking at the color of the blood vessel and understanding what those colors refer to. So you've got this oxygen poor blood coming into the right atrium from several sources. The main sources of blood coming into that part of the heart are what are called the superior and inferior venae cavae. Again, AE would be plural, one would be just A. So superior vena cava is coming from the head and neck, dumping into the right atrium superiorly, and the inferior vena cava is a large vein, basically. These are both veins that are carrying oxygen poor blood from the lower 2/3 of the body, the viscera, the torso, the legs, and that's where the blood's coming from that dumps into the right atrium. Another source of oxygen poor blood that dumps into the right atrium is something called the coronary sinus. And we're going to talk more about that. I'm going to show you a diagram of that in a little bit later. But remember how we said that the heart itself gets a good oxygen-rich blood supply via the coronary arteries, but it also has on its surface what are called cardiac veins. And these veins are basically draining blood from the myocardium, after which the CO2 has been taken up by the blood. Okay, and that oxygen poor blood coming from the heart muscle itself dumps into this larger swelling called the coronary sinus, and that's going to dump into the right atrium. So you'll be seeing that in just a little while. Inferior to the right atrium is the right ventricle. So this next chamber, the second, if you will, of the 4, is going to receive blood, again blue in color to denote oxygen poor, from the right atrium. So the right ventricle receives blood from the right atrium. We have a left atrium. Now note that I'm coloring this red to indicate that this chamber, I should say, is getting oxygen-rich blood. And that oxygen-rich blood, guess where that's coming from? It's coming from the lungs, yeah. And so we have these 4 blood vessels called pulmonary arteries, or veins, excuse me, pulmonary veins, that are taking that oxygen-rich blood from the right and left lungs and dumping it into the left atrium. Now this is a good time to talk about what is a vein and what is an artery. Veins basically do one thing, and that is they deliver blood to the heart. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Generally, the blood that's coming to the heart, generally, is oxygen-poor blood. And arteries generally carry oxygen-rich blood. The exception to the rule is here with respect to the pulmonary veins, and as you'll see in a few minutes, the pulmonary arteries. So these veins are not carrying blue blood, if you will. We would color those blood vessels red, because remember, they're carrying blood to the heart, so they're veins, but where is the blood coming from? It's coming from the lungs. Okay, so that's why pulmonary veins are carrying oxygen-rich blood to the left atrium from the right. From there, just like we saw earlier with respect to blood flow from the right atrium into the right ventricle, in this case, the blood is going to be transported from the left ventricle from the left atrium rather into the left ventricle. So it comes into the atria first, then it dumps into the corresponding ventricles. Now between the atria, right atrium, left atrium, and its corresponding set of ventricles inferiorly, we have what are called atrioventricular valves, or sometimes we just use the abbreviation AV for atrioventricular, AV. These literally lie between an atrium and the ventricle. So let's look at the two AV valves. On the right-hand side of the heart, so this heart is facing you, so what appears to be your right is the heart's left, and vice versa. So here we have on the right-hand side the right atrium, so that's this. Here's the right ventricle, everything down here basically. And between the two is what's called the tricuspid valve. Tricuspid has three cusps, three little flaps here. We'll show you a better diagram of that in a few minutes, but that's where the tri comes in. Three cusps to this valve. And on the left side of the heart is the bicuspid, so two cusps versus the three on the right. On the left, you've got the bicuspid or mitral valve. And the term mitral comes from the term mitre. If you ever have noticed a bishop, somebody who's of a higher category in a religious order, for example, the Catholic Church or some other Christian denominations have bishops, and on special religious occasions, let's say like Easter or First Communion, that kind of thing, he will be wearing this kind of funny looking hat with the two kind of pointy components at the very, very tip. Yeah, that's called his mitre, So mitral refers to the two little pointy cusps here, sort of, within this valve. Now note that whether we're talking about the tricuspid valve on the right or the bicuspid valve on the left, as we follow these cusps toward the ventricles, they tend to sort of taper and get thinner and form what are referred to here as the chordae tendineae. So the chordae tendineae basically help to anchor the cusps of the AV valves. And they're very, very thin, rather strong, very, very strong fibrous cords. So I'm kind of tracing the chordae tendineae. They're coming off of the cusps of the valves, the AV valves. And these chordae tendineae will actually attach the valves to what are referred to here as papillary muscles. So these little sort of finger-like projections, remember dermal papillae? Well, these are papillary muscles of the heart, and they're kind of like finger-like, aren't they? And so here's the chordae tendineae contacting these papillary muscles. And so the idea here is when the tricuspid and bicuspid valves close, okay, when these guys close, and we'll talk about the opening and closing of valves in a few moments, but when these valves snap shut, these papillary muscles, since they're connected to the chordae tendineae, are going to pull on them and prevent these AV valves from prolapsing back into the atria. So when AV valves snap shut, they snap shut perfectly tight, so no blood regurgitates backwards up into the atria. You don't want that to happen. If you have regurgitation of blood, that's called a heart murmur or a prolapse of the valve. And typically, we don't want to see prolapsing of valves. We don't want to see blood regurgitating back into the corresponding atria, although that can happen sometimes. There are, I think, something like 8% of the American public suffers from mitral valve prolapse. It's not a dangerous condition. Actually, it's just an inherited, rather benign statistic. But that's sort of interesting, isn't it? So again, when these valves snap shut, they snap shut nice and tight, and no blood regurgitates back into the atria because these papillary muscles pull on the chordae tendineae, and the chordae tendineae pull on the valves in turn, and so when they snap shut nice and tight. We also have, in addition to the two AV valves, two semilunar valves. And here's one of the two, called the pulmonary semilunar valve. What does the term pulmonary refer to? Lungs, right? Lungs. So here we're talking about a valve that also has three cusps. You can kind of see those here. 1, 2, and a little bit of the third. And this particular valve lies between the right ventricle, which is down here, and what's called the pulmonary trunk, which is right here. Note that this valve has no chordae tendineae, no papillary muscles like the AV valves do. Okay, so they just have the three cusps. And so when blood is ejected from the right ventricle and this tricuspid valve snaps shut, this valve will open up and blood will travel into the pulmonary trunk, and this will take blood eventually into the left and right pulmonary arteries. And what did we say that artery was? Remember, it's a blood vessel that takes blood away from the heart, but in the case of pulmonary arteries, note the color of these blood vessels. It's blue, right? That means it's oxygen poor blood. Okay, and it's going to be carrying this blood so that it can be oxygenated. So this is part of the pulmonary circuit that we're getting into here, isn't it? Is the aortic semilunar valve. And so we've cut away part of the pulmonary trunk here. We've removed the pulmonary semilunar valve so we can see in a little better detail the aortic semilunar valve. And this does not show the three cusps quite as well as the pulmonary valve did, but it also has three cusps. And note again the term aortic. This is telling us that once the blood passes through this valve, in this case from the left ventricle, it enters the largest artery of the body, and this is called the aorta. This big arching structure, the arch of the aorta. It's a very, very large blood vessel, and so this semilunar valve is taking blood into the aorta from the left ventricle. Here's a cadaver heart, or actually quite a fresh one. Not to get disgusting or anything, but it's not preserved. It looks quite fresh. What I didn't point out in some of the earlier diagrams is this piece of myocardium located between the right ventricle and the left ventricle, called the interventricular septum. Now, what does inter mean? Inter means between. Between what? Between the ventricles. So here's the right ventricle, here's the left ventricle. Okay. What else can we see here? Well, here's the right atrium, here's the tricuspid valve, here's the left atrium, here's the bicuspid valve. We can also see, I made a mess here, haven't I? We can see some papillary muscles pointed to by the yellow arrows, and we can see chordae tendineae pointed out by the blue arrows, which are again anchoring these AV valves to the papillary muscles. Here's the myocardium that we talked about one of the earlier slides, myocardium, the wall of the heart. And note that the left myocardial wall here is thicker, isn't it, than the right. We'll talk about why that is in just a couple minutes, but it's actually quite thin. Not nearly as thick as it is in the left side, much thicker on the left side. And of course, here's the apex, tilted a little bit left of center. This is just a magnified view of the tricuspid valve. We can see the right atrium here at the top. Here's several of the cusps of the tricuspid valve. Here's some chordae tendineae. You can kind of see these very thin white cord-like structures, and then below them, these are papillary muscles here. Here's the interventricular septum, right here. The left ventricle would be over here on this side. This is the right ventricle over here. Here we've taken and cut through all 4 valves. We have the 2 semilunar valves here, and this is likely the aortic semilunar valve. This is probably the pulmonary semilunar valve. And then we have the 2 AV valves. Again, kind of hard to tell exactly whether this is right or left. Can't see the cusps, so I can't really tell you. But if there was 3, that'd be tri. If there was 2, it'd be bi, right? But we're looking down from above, and what is shown very nicely here are the 3 cusps in each of the 2 semilunar valves, the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves. You can see those really quite nicely here. Here's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. These are closed. You might wonder what these structures here are. These are blood vessels that are servicing the heart muscle itself. That's what those are. I can't tell if they're coronary arteries or cardiac veins. It's hard to tell. Okay, so back to blood flow through the heart. We talked about this earlier, pulmonary circuit, systemic circuit, right? So now let's talk about blood flow. Let's take all these different pieces of the puzzle and put them together. So let's begin with oxygen-poor blood coming to the heart via veins, right? So here we've got capillary beds, systemic capillary beds. Here we've got systemic capillary beds. So we've given up the oxygen already. We're taking on CO2. We're coloring this blood now blue, right? So here comes the blue blood entering the heart either through the superior vena cava, which is this, or the inferior vena cava, which is down below. Either way, we enter into the right atrium here. We pass through the first AV valve. Here's tricuspid valve, right? We enter into the right ventricle. Then we pass through the first of 2 semilunar valves. This is the pulmonary semilunar valve because we're going toward the lungs now. We enter the pulmonary trunk. It splits into a left and right branch. Okay, so we have a left pulmonary artery and we have a right pulmonary artery, which is this structure right here. Hard to draw an arrow, but there it is. And there, of course, the blood carrying oxygen-poor blood, right, is going to give up a lot of its carbon dioxide. It's going to take on oxygen. And now we're going to bring that oxygen-rich blood back to the heart. And that's going to be via 4 pulmonary veins. You've got 2 here on the left side, and here's the other 2 on the right side. Either way, the blood is going to be transported next into the left atrium, and here we are, left atrium, through our second AV valve, which is the bicuspid or mitral valve, into the left ventricle, that's this. From here, we pass through our second semilunar valve, this is the aortic semilunar valve, into the aorta, which is going to take that blood again then to our systemic tissues, where we will give up that oxygen, we will take on carbon dioxide, and we will repeat the process again. So pulmonary and systemic circuits alternating with one another, providing adequate blood flow throughout the body. So this is just a really great slide. It takes into account all these various components and chambers and valves. Do spend some time looking at this. Very, very important. This is simply a flow chart, and I just went through this in the diagram pointing things out, so take some time and look through this, be able to trace the blood from the systemic circuit, right, where it has given up its oxygen, it's now carrying oxygen poor blood, and we got to bring that back to the heart, and then of course we have to take it to the lungs, right, give up a lot of that carbon dioxide, pick up oxygen, and then deliver it back to the heart. And then the heart has to deliver it back to the systemic circuit, and then we repeat the process again, right? So take some time, look over this flowchart, should make perfect sense. I've incorporated again where we have both AV valves and where we've got semilunar valves. You can see where those are located relative to the various chambers. So we've talked a little bit about how the heart muscle itself receives oxygen-rich blood. It should. It's doing all this pumping, right? It deserves a good oxygenated blood supply, and it gets that. So when that blood comes back to the lungs, it gets taken into the left atrium, across the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, and then out the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta, right? So just to orient you here, here's the aorta at the top. Here is the aortic semilunar valve that's been sectioned. And remember, this lies between the left ventricle and the aorta. And I want you to note here, though, that in addition to carrying the blood into the aorta from the left ventricle, there are some branches off of the valve itself into two super important blood vessels. And you see those listed down below in green. The right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. Note again the color, red to indicate oxygen-rich blood. And so these are the two first set of arteries that are going to begin to deliver this oxygen-rich blood to the heart muscle itself, the right and left arteries. So we can depict this quite nicely with a flow chart. So here's the aorta that we had described a little bit earlier. And remember, right there at that aortic semilunar valve was where these two arteries branched. So it's carrying just super oxygen-rich blood, these arteries are. The right coronary artery in turn divides into what's called the posterior interventricular artery. Now note, inter means between the ventricles. So this is going to be delivering blood to the right and left ventricles. The other branch off the right coronary artery is called the marginal artery, and it's going to be delivering blood to the right atrium and right ventricle. And then branching off the left coronary artery is an artery called the circumflex artery, which, as you follow the flowchart, is going to deliver oxygen-rich blood to the left atrium and left ventricle. And finally, the anterior interventricular artery. So we had posterior over here. Now we have anterior between the ventricles. And this likewise will deliver oxygen-rich blood to both right and left ventricles. So the interventricular arteries, be they anterior or posterior, service both the right and left ventricles, while the marginal artery is delivering blood to both right atrium and right ventricle, so right half of the heart, while the circumflex delivers oxygen-rich blood to the left half of the heart, left atrium and left ventricle. So we are servicing all chambers of the heart. In fact, I would argue the ventricles get hit by all of these various arteries, don't they? So there's adequate blood flow going to all four chambers. And then once that oxygen is given up and the CO2 is brought aboard, because remember the muscle is contracting, it's metabolizing, it's generating CO2 via aerobic respiration like any tissue would, then the blood eventually makes its way through a series of blood vessels that we're going to just call for right now the cardiac veins. They have all different names. And as it mentions here, the pathway of those cardiac veins, now delivering blood technically back to the heart, even though it's really kind of in the heart, These are anatomically located very close to these various coronary blood vessels that we talked about before here. Ultimately, those blood vessels, those cardiac veins carrying oxygen-poor blood from the heart muscle itself, is going to dump into the coronary sinus. Now, where have you heard of that? We talked about that earlier, remember? The coronary sinus was one of those structures that dumped blood into the right atrium. The other two were the superior and inferior vena cavae. So that oxygen-poor blood dumps right into the right ventricle. And then, of course, where's it taken from there? Remember, right atrium, tricuspid valve, right ventricle, pulmonary semilunar valve, pulmonary trunk, right and left pulmonary arteries. The blood gets oxygenated, comes back via the 4 pulmonary veins to the left atrium, across the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, through the aortic semilunar valve, and then aorta, and through the rest of the systemic circuit. So do spend some time taking a look at these blood vessels.
A single cardiac cycle is made up of
Action potentials originate in the increased blood pressure stretches the increased blood pressure stretches the